sharing this experience with us. My name is Wolfgang Nansbegruber. I'm the director of the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination, and it is a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome you here at the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. And as some of you might ask the question, why is an institute on self-determination, not for self-determination, on self-determination, interested in, engaged in working, doing research, and bringing this into the teaching curriculum of the fate and role of children in armed conflicts? It's a very simple answer. A, we really believe that determining your destiny is a quintessential element of contemporary political relations, on the national, on the local, and also on the international plan. But B, unfortunately, in most of these situations in which the Institute has so far been involved, Balkans, Southeastern Europe, Central Asia, Middle East, and increasingly Africa, the issue of the fate of civilians, and especially their women and children, is of particular relevance. Let me add here that since I'm the founding director of this institute, I have been shaped by an experience with two children in war. When I was in Bosnia during war conditions in 1995, at that time I was 21, I saw a 12-year-old girl with her brother and a plastic bag, and he had a teddy bear coming from the field. And we were in a valley where there was no noise except the screaming of the cows, which haven't been open for days. German armored personnel carriers have actually electric engine, so you only hear the zzz, not like when the Humvees come. The next thing I saw was a poof. She ran and came. But being this little lightweight kiddo, she flew off and she survived, obviously. But the next question was, since we wanted to run in, are there more mines? Lo and behold, she got saved, and I was with British forces at that time, and she survived very well. But believe me, it changed my perspective. So, and anybody who has seen the Freedom Bridge in Sarajevo under combat knows what I mean. Whatever I've lived in Bosnia and also in Yugoslavia and also in Kosovo, it's a little bit trumped now by what I get as experiences from Syria. I haven't been there yet. Typically, my action is always that I do go to the places on which I'm working. But on a conceptual plane, we have to recognize four elements which are in relevance with the role and the situation of children in conflict. Clearly, in most cases, and I dare say because of traumatization, in all cases, children are victims. They become traumatized, they suffer. They suffer by personal experience, but they also suffer by witnessing. Many times, children can tell stories of what's happening to their parents, to their siblings, to their neighbors. The children, as we saw in the film, and as unfortunately I've heard some conflict accounts in regular forces, can also be actors. unwillingly or deliberately. And then children are sometimes deliberately used in all kinds of organizations. The more we go into the e-warfare, the more there are operations by young ones and very young ones. But finally, and most importantly, the involvement of children, the young ones, contributes majorly to the perpetuation of the conflict. The notion of revenge, the element of, when they go out, setting records straight, equalizing accounts. You don't know how many times I heard that. Does, unfortunately, relate to the role of children. And for anybody, I think the suffering of one child is too much. The suffering of anybody in the conflict is too much. But I'm particularly pleased that in cooperation with the Permanent Mission of Liechtenstein, the Principality of Liechtenstein with the United Nations, and other of the organizations, we can hopefully contribute here to foster non-polemicized, profound, conceptual, and intellectual debate. And my message goes primarily to my younger colleagues here. This is an issue with which in the world we live. We will have more and more to deal with, because clearly the age group of acting and receiving is again decreasing, meaning younger and younger ones get involved and suffer most, and typically these are civilians who suffer most. With this, I'm delighted to welcome here. I very much am pleased that the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination can be as a host here, but I also hope that we can contribute in whatever way you so desire, and whatever you feel sort of foster and enhance a productive and fruitful and meeting connected to the impact in the actual workings and life in the UN institutions, the Security Council, and beyond, eventually then being implemented in real life. Unfortunately, as I always argue, we have many realities. We have the international reality, we have the national reality, and we obviously have the local reality. And the film before all too plainly showed how complex and how challenging this can be. And with this, thanks again to the co-organizers, and I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Beth English.
Hi, thank you. I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers so that we can go ahead and get started here and hopefully have plenty of time for discussion. The theme of today's panel is to talk about what the role of the UN and the role of NGOs is or can be in protecting the rights of children affected by armed conflict. And so to that end, today we have three panelists. We have, beginning over here to focus on my right, is Alec Wargo, and he is Program Officer for the Office of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict. That's a position he's held since 2004. In the center, we have Joe Becker, Advocacy Director for the Children's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. And she was just here earlier speaking about a book that she has just written, so maybe we'll hear a little bit about that. And also then here on the other end is Ava Smets, Director of Watchlist on Children and Armed Conflict. And then moderating the Q&A and offering some more substantive opening remarks will be Swan Dornig. He is Second Secretary at the Permanent Mission of Liechtenstein to the United Nations in New York. If anyone is following on Twitter, we are tweeting at #CAAC.
Okay. Thank you very much, Beth, for the very, very nice and friendly introduction. And before I give the floor to our distinguished panelists, let me take the opportunity to briefly welcome you also on behalf of the Permanent Mission of Liechtenstein to the United Nations to this panel on children armed conflict, and give you some rationality why we've organized it. As Beth already mentioned, this panel is part of a two-day workshop conceived with our partners, the LISD, here at Princeton University, and Watchlist on Children Armed Conflict, an NGO from New York. It's actually one of our closest civil society allies at the UN. The protection of the rights of children affected by armed conflict is among the top priorities of Liechtenstein at the United Nations, and is certainly a topic that is very dear to our foreign minister. I think we all know, and in a few minutes we will hear more about this, the plight of children affected by armed conflict is beyond imagination. Despite all efforts by the international community, today there are still more than 250,000 children associated with armed forces. They do not only take part in direct combat, but also serve as porters, lookouts, messengers, and cooks. And the situation of girls is particularly vulnerable, as they often, in addition to taking part in direct hostilities, are forced to serve as sex slaves. To address the suffering of those children, the Security Council developed throughout the last decade a whole agenda that, despite the large number of children still associated with armed conflict, is widely perceived as one of the great success stories of the United Nations, at least from an institutional point of view. Throughout the last couple of years, the activities of Liechtenstein were focused on making the framework of this agenda understandable and accessible, both to the public, to the wider public, and the Security Council itself. And now you might ask yourself, why the Security Council? They set up the whole framework, so they must know about it. Well, as you will learn in a few seconds, the legal framework of the agenda consists of 9 Security Council resolutions and various presidential statements, and the task to reflect the obligations that derive from these resolutions in the country-specific work of the Security Council, for instance, on Afghanistan or Somalia, is quite challenging. So today's panel discussion and the workshop here in Princeton is hence another effort of our mission, and also not our mission, but also of our partners, to support the Security Council in implementing the agenda. And we are fully convinced that this two-day workshop, in the end, will also serve as a good example of cooperation between non-members of the Security Council and Security Council members, and will hope to hold the perpetrators of the rights of children affected by armed conflicts accountable. On that note, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker this afternoon, Alec Wargo from the Office of the SSG. And I'm sure and convinced that after his presentation you will understand a bit more why this whole agenda is so complex. So.
Thank you, Sven. Thank you, Dr. Danschak-Trüber, Dr. English, at the University of Princeton University. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I know that my chief, the Undersecretary General Zerugi, would like to have been here, but she was called away for several days and could not come. I know that she would be pleased to come on another occasion to address both the Institute and the community at the university. I find it odd that I've been asked to do this, because as a student, I was a very bad student at university, and I, as my colleagues will tell you, I'm very focused, but I have an attention deficit of some sort or another. So I never attended class. I read a lot, but never attended class. Lectures were very rare. So I find it very fitting that I should be asked to give one. So you'll bear with me. And I hope you won't fall asleep like I usually do when I hear most lectures. But again, on this subject, it's hard to fall asleep because the subject is depressing in the sense that when we think about children in armed conflict, we rarely think about good things. And as the professor has given to you, I had also spent 3 years in Bosnia and saw lots of legless children. I've spent a number of years in Congo where we visited more horrors on children. And of course, I've just visited with the Special Representative of Syria, where things are hardly better. But what I'm going to do for you today is give you a little bit of what our office has done and what the UN is doing, or not doing. And again, I have a lot of my colleagues from the UN community and the international community here who will probably have a lot to say about how we can maybe do things better. So, to cut the long story short, I'd like to describe for you a number of things about the background of the engagement of the Security Council and the UN. And I think that we as an office, though we deal with the General Assembly and we deal with the Human Rights Council, the Security Council has been for us a primary mover. And why is that? The Security Council is, whether we like it or not, the only body of the United Nations that has the power to compel. It may not always be very good at it, but it does have the power to compel when it is unified, when there is something that they really want to achieve, they can and often do it. And so for us, and our discussions tomorrow will also be very valuable for the work, both of the office and I think of the working group. One of the issues that they have seized on most successfully and for the longest period as a thematic is children under conflict. And what I'll do is I'm going to tell you about how we got there. I've already kind of told you how we got there, but I'm off my notes already. Our work started in earnest in the 1990s, when images of the brutal wars in Liberia and Sierra Leone were filling our televisions, and also, of course, Bosnia. And the consciousness of the world was shaken. It was a new, I think what most people who were living or working on these subjects in the UN were saying was, you know, we've seen violence before. We've seen children hurt in war before, but we haven't seen them as the targets of that violence. Not only as victims, but also targeters themselves. And it's the first time when we see child soldiers on the scene in a big way. One of the things that I remember most from the Sierra Leone, although I wasn't there myself, from the Sierra Leone crisis, was, I believe it was an Irish, or I think it was an Irish battalion, it was a unit in Sierra Leone, who were so surprised by a huge, another unit of children, that they didn't know what to do. Yeah. And they were taken, in fact, hostage. For a little while, it resolved itself. But it was a huge lesson also for peacekeepers that, as Eric had said, there are two realities here. We usually think of children as victims, but sometimes they're forced. And again, I want to use the word forced. They don't get up in the morning and say, I want to be part of an armed group. When we hear about the stories of Sierra Leonean children, how they were forced to kill their own parents to stay, how they were drugged to do things that they didn't want to do. But when they come into contact with soldiers, our peacekeepers, it becomes a huge, huge issue. And it's something that we're doing a lot with now with NATO, who are doing training with our peacekeepers, and the whole gamut of activity. So I think what Grâce Michel, I'm getting back to the beginnings of our mandate, Grâce Michel was asked in 1995 to write a report on what was happening with children on conflict. Grâce Michel was, of course, the former social affairs minister of Mozambique, which had itself gone through a civil war, and where thousands of children were also used. And after her groundbreaking work, she went through a crucial number of issues where she thought that the UN had to do better. I think she brought up a number of issues, and you can get it on our website. It's about this big. So, but the chief issues that are of interest to our mandate that came out were IDP children, refugee children, what was happening to them, what was happening to child soldiers. And it's the first time when we really had a deep discussion about child soldiers. What is that? And what was happening to them? And what happens to them after the war stops? I think she went into great detail on the psychosocial needs of these children, as the professor had also said, on reintegration. How do you get them back into their communities? Especially when, in many instances, they've done a huge amount of damage, or been forced to do a huge amount of damage. And having been lived in Congo myself, I was very, I worked on child protection from peacekeeping's perspective. There's also, most of these children get into these armed groups not because they're abducted, although that happens quite a bit. Many of them have family problems before they leave. And even if you have a community that's willing to take them on, reintegrating them is a long-term process. And she went over that. She also said that as the UN, one UN, we talk about one UN all the time. She also said that we weren't very unified about what our message was about children on conflict. and that it was too bad that we had waited until 1995 to speak about it as one topic, and thirdly, that we had to do more. And one of the chief, we're very selfish in my office, one of the chief recommendations was that there should be an Undersecretary General for Children in Armed Conflict. And so in 1996, our office was born. Our first, we were very lucky to have Olara Tunu, who was the then previously the Ugandan ambassador to the UN, who had served on the Security Council. And why is that important? Because in 1997, when he started to work, his first thing, he said, I know because I was around. I was actually in Kigali at the time with UNHCR, but was in touch with his office. His big idea was, look, we can do lots of reports, or we can advocate, and he was out there advocating for all kinds of things, regional organizations, books, films, very important. But he said, as the UN, we could always do more in our small silos, but if we want to really stop this in its tracks, and if we want to responsibilize these parties, we have to get the Security Council involved. And again, as I said before, the Security Council, though it isn't every solution by far, and it has its own ups and downs, is the only, it is the only body of the UN that can compel parties to behave. And I think that it was a constellation of both chance and design. I think we, in the post-Cold War euphoria in the early 90s, when we were starting to see, but also when all these African conflicts were heating up, we had a much more, how shall we say, a much more forward-looking atmosphere inside of the council. People were willing to do more. People were willing, after a huge, long slumber of the council during the Cold War, to try to do more. So we had that. Secondly, we had Olara Tunu, who was a very, very clever man, I must say, and who drove and had a vision for where he wanted to get from the very get-go. He didn't always reveal it to his staff, he would reveal it in small pieces, but what he did was he said, I'm going to get us from a report to the council to getting them to list parties, which they would never do, to then going on to saying that they're going to have sanctions and to take it really on board and to start discussing it as a matter of peace and security, which is the only thing that the Security Council is mandated to do. It's important to note that the peace and security agenda of the Council and the adoption of Children on Conflict made it no longer just a side issue. It made it key and core to peace and peace building of the Council. Because even today, you always have, when they're designing new, which we're going to discuss on Afghanistan and other things, when they're designing new mandates, we have a better pickup from the council members, but we still always have to fight. It's not always the core key issue. And of course, children is not always the core key issue in every conflict. But we are getting closer with every day to the realization that child soldiers, rape of children, the 6th grade violations, abductions of children, grave sexual violence against children, that these are piece of the core piece of the puzzle of how we unpack war and then put it back together to make peace. And that is so important for the children on the ground through the missions that the mandates that the Security Council gives. And I am so far off the speech, it's not fun. I'm just getting caught up. That we had that. How did that work? I must say, Olara Tunu, as the Undersecretary General, could only do so much. He could present reports, he could have lunch with ambassadors, he could get UNICEF and others on board, he could get the member states and the friends on board to all push in one direction. But I think, I think really it was a constellation of very fortuitous events that we had Jean-Marc de la Sablière, who was then the permanent representative of France. This is a man who had many other things on his mind from day to day, but who took the time to really design with Olara Tunu how far we're going to go. Sometimes he thought we were going too far too fast, but he was the one inside of the council convincing the P5s and the US. UK, of course, was always there, but also getting kind of that vision of what can we really do And as you know, our member state friends, especially those on the council, are very conservative. So if it's something new, then they're always searching in their papers very quickly for language that they've already agreed upon years and years ago, and there wasn't any. So in order to have that, you really needed a dynamic kind of USG, a dynamic ambassador who could bring on board the other big players, the P5, and he did. And we got, in that time, that was much more, how shall we say, open time, where possibilities were more possible in the council. We seized it. They got our first resolution where they asked for a yearly report. A yearly report in itself is not important, except for in the United Nations, because nothing moves without a report. And the first reports were, in today's vision, a bit wishy-washy. I know I gave some even from Congo, gave some inputs into them. But they weren't very general. They were saying, we have problems with IDPs, we have problems with refugees. There's these child soldiers running in all of these parts. And the key thing, which they probably captured themselves in, because sometimes the Security Council is too clever for its own good. They said, well, you want us to impose sanctions, you want us to stop this, but you have to tell us exactly what's happening, when, where, why, in a timely way. We want you to do that. And we said, well, okay. Then we went back to the drawing board, and in the typical UN fashion, we took 5 years to do it. So to get everybody on board, to get UNHCR on board, UNICEF, ourselves, thinking what are the grave violations the 6 grave violations, which are all fairly obvious, took us about 5 years to come to an agreement on. And then to say, well, and of course, NGOs were always there and advocating with us, and sometimes disagreeing with Human Rights Watch, but also supporting us and kind of pushing all of that policy through with the friends. We came up with that thing after 5 years, which was a plan that said how we're going to monitor, what we're going to monitor, what is the cadence of the monitoring, and what do we want, which is we want, in the end, if there's a party out there that's doing bad stuff, we want you to put that into peacekeeping mandates. We want you to sanction the hell out of them. We want you to do anything that's possible to get them out of where they are or out of danger. So then we presented that, and that led to further argument in the council. But we got, in 2005, what is a seminal resolution, and Olara to the swan song, which was the monitoring reporting resolution. And that's important because we come forward and basically answering the council's challenge, which was, and I think some of the council members thought we could never agree, which is pretty true, inside of the UN, because we have so many problems doing that. But we did. We persevered for children. And then they came up with, I remember in the meeting, I think it was a meeting with between Olara and I think Jean-Marc, where Lara spun it out and said, what we really need is we need a sanctions committee of the council. And I remember, I think Jean-Marc's papers fell out of his hand because he thought that was completely crazy. And of course it is still completely crazy. You don't have a thematic sanctions council with the sanctions committee of the council. It just doesn't, on a softy issue like children, forget it. So then we backpedaled, we said, well, we're going to fling it out there, we're going to see what's going to go on. And in the end, after much fighting, I think it took, how many months did it take? It took several months to get the Resolution 1612 put in place. They agreed to something that is now the engine of what the Council does for children, which is the Security Council Working Group on Children Armed Conflict. And that is a subsidiary body of the Council of all 15 members that sits every 2 months or more formally, and hundreds of times more a year on their informal meetings. And they argue about our reports and how to put them together. And I know there are several members of this group who have probably lost much of their lives in some of these very arcane discussions. But they have gotten what we call conclusions, which are recommendations to these parties, both governments, non-state actors, the UN system, donors. And they put them out, and those are then our instructions from the Council. And again, it's from the Council, so you can send something from the GA and pick it up, put it in a drawer, and wait a year, and they'll do the same thing. But for the Security Council, peacekeeping missions, they pick it up and it becomes an order. Agencies, they pick it up, it becomes an order. For us, it becomes our lifeblood of how we then move in these situations to make the situation better for children with our partners on the ground, including NGOs, civil society, the UN system, and council members, and of course academics, others that are all building this huge kind of machine that gets results for children on the ground. One of the key elements of how these country situations, we can't say country because sometimes, anyway, it's the UN, so we say country situations because we can't agree of when we have a country, and we can't agree as the UN of when we have armed conflicts, so we say country situations. Even though it's in our title, we can't agree about what armed conflict is, so we put a disclaimer saying it's not an armed conflict, but it is. And so we get along. But one of the chief elements of the reporting that goes in, which was asked for, and defines how the working group kind of seizes country situations or parties to conflict who violate children's rights, is this list of shame that is attached to our report, which is the most sexy thing, in fact, because it's the only thing the AP or even the NGOs sometimes, when it just comes up, they take the last page off, which is the annex list of who's been naughty and who's been a little bit nice, but is still too naughty to get off this list. Is a list of parties to conflict in country situations around the world who continue to violate children's rights. This sounds like, to the untrained ear, this is an obvious thing to do if you want to move for compliance. But it's the UN, so the UN doesn't shame people openly. They kind of have, private little conversations in the back rooms and say, oh, you shouldn't be so naughty, or you really shouldn't, kill those children as often as you do. It doesn't really happen like that, although maybe sometimes it does. But this brings, it's so crucial because it's explosive. It's like a supernova of accountability in the UN system that you present to the council, which is the only body that can compel a list of who's been naughty and what you want them to do. So I think it's so novel, and even it sounds completely logical, but it's so novel because that then determines how the council picks up on those country situations, what parties are looking at, and then how country situations, civil society, and others choose to move and to advocate for a better life for children. Now, I can't tell you that everybody who should be on that list is on that list, because sometimes we have problems there. Sometimes it's, I wouldn't say it's mostly political problems, because every Secretary General who has to approve these lists, sometimes with tears in his or her eyes, and DPA will know because we have lots of nice internal discussions. I wouldn't say it's political problems, but many times it's about access to particular areas where groups may be violating, but we don't have enough information. Because one of the things that the Council demands is that when we present verified information, it has to be verified by the UN. It doesn't mean that NGOs and others aren't heavily involved, but in the end we have to have a partnership and training so that we know that that information is valid for the UN, and that the UN will stand by that information. And so there we have issues in places, for example, I shouldn't say it, but like in Dagestan, there is no UN presence within hundreds of miles of there. We kind of get some things out of there, but we can't figure it out. I'm not saying there's an armed conflict there. I'm not saying that children are suffering, but it's these kind of incidences where we might have parties that aren't listed when they should be. But at the same time, I think everybody who works on this issue knows that, for the most part, the list that we have covers the big ones. Now, I'm going to go back because, again, I'm so far off this thing, I have to see what my next big topic is. We've got lists, so we have the listing, we have the Security Council working group, and then now we go on to targeted measures. Targeted measures is going to be, oh, we have 5 minutes. Okay, so targeted measures is something which is basically a code word for sanctions, which is also a very naughty word in the UK, because lots of people don't like to talk about sanctions because we'd have to actually do something and make a list and find their passport number and what the bank account is. They have been applied. They have been applied against those violators that are on a list for 5 years, which we call our perpetual, or not perpetual, we call it persistent violator, persistent violators. And they've been applied in Cote d'Ivoire, they've been applied in Somalia, they've been applied in Sudan, and DRC. Democratic Republic of Congo. So the council, and in fact, Sudan, I think, is still deliberating. They have heard evidence, but still sitting on it. So they have actually sanctioned persons, which is also highly unusual. Because usually, you know, if you're a huge terrorista or something like that, although we don't use the word terrorist, we use people who use terror tactics. But it's amazing that they've done as much as they can, but the whole targeted measure, the whole system is A, very conservative, and secondly, very limited, in the sense that you can fit all the sanctions committees of the Security Council on 2 hands, more or less. So one of them is a little bit broader because it's about counterterrorism or Al-Qaeda and Taliban. They're super conservative. But then they're mostly country-based. So you have one for Cote d'Ivoire, you have one for Sudan. We have basically covered all of the sanctions committees that have a country situation attached to them. So what do we do, which is what we're going to be discussing at the Institute tomorrow. What do we do short of sanctions, or how we expand sanctions, but also what do we do short of sanctions to bring compliance? And there's plenty of things that we can do. And one of the chief tools that we've had and developed over time about how to get parties off this list, because we get them on, we shame the hell out of them. They don't like it. It's kind of like grief, so you go through denial, and then you go through sadness, and then you come to crying, hysteria, and then finally they invite you onto the platform. You can speak about it. We've done this now with we have action plans, which are basically contracts between the UN and either a state armed force or a non-state actor. And we've done this now. We have sealed 18 agreements, of which we've run through, or basically got them to approve to undertake all the activities in the contract, including to release children, punish those who are accountable, etc., etc. We do this both for sexual violence. We do this for children on conflict, or child soldiers, which is the biggest one. But we also have it for killing and maiming, and for sexual violence. And we have succeeded to delist, I believe it's 7 parties, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal,
Uganda.
And in Uganda. So, and we've done that with both governments and non-state actors. So we've had success where we have this contract, where we're able to access these parties or this government, where we bring them through the whole process of pleading and yelling at us and denying it. Where we get down, we do the business, we confirm that they're complying, and we get out. Doesn't mean that everything is peaceful in that particular country situation, but they're not harming children or actively doing so. We have another 18 action plans that are now being applied throughout the world, from situations as varied as Philippines, Myanmar, which is a huge one that we're still working on, Afghanistan, Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, CAR, Central African Republic, and we will soon have Mexico as well. So we know how to get people on the list, we know how to bring them through the process when they cry, and we sometimes cry, and then we can get them into compliance. And this machine, it does work, but it is not necessarily there because we still have 52 parties in 13 country situations around the world who are persistent perpetrators. So again, going back to what do we do when we can't get them compliant? Some of it's our own fault as the UN system when we're not prioritizing. Many times we have other complicating issues where a government, for example, refuses to allow the UN access, or sometimes even NGO access to particular parties. Grosso modo, we're still in the phase of perfecting the system, but it works. It works for children in many ways, but it always has to be tinkered with. And we rely on every chair that we have and all of our friends. And of course, Canada is the chief of our group of friends who are our chief cheerleaders and pushers from outside of the council, because we only have 15 council members at a time. We work with our council members. The P5, of course, are the ones who are always there. But we have the non-permanent members who are oftentimes leaders in their own right. And, of course, France was our first chair for several terms. We had Mexico, who did a wonderful job. We have just had Germany, who brought to you our latest listing criteria of attacks against schools and hospitals. And now, of course, we have Luxembourg, who are taking on the helm of the working group and doing fantastic job. However, the whole system always has to be tinkered with. We have new challenges every time. I'm going to end it in five seconds. And I really didn't read any of the speech, so don't tell my boss. There are new challenges at every moment, in the sense that the nature of conflict is always changing. And we see that in Syria, and we also see the paralysis of what can be done in the council in Syria. I just accompanied my boss to Syria in December, and I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, it's a mess. The UN is very, very thin on the ground. NGOs, there are some who are strong, but they're also thin on the ground and can't move as much as we would like to. And I think that it's all of our responsibility, including academics, including students and others, to pressure our governments to move more brusquely, to find a solution, a political solution, that we can stop that violence. And what we should do, from my office's perspective and with our partners, is to put the child's face of that trauma before them. I mean, when you go to, my boss visits Yarmouk refugee camp and the outskirts of Damascus, the government says that they're taking all measures to prevent collateral damage, and they bomb the school 24 hours later while we're in country. You know there's something wrong. And so there is a huge amount for the UN system and ourselves to do. Mali is another example, where we have new types of groups that are utilizing children in horrible ways. I'm going to leave it there, because I think I've hopefully given you a glimpse of what the council and what we do with the council and how that process moves forward for children, with the caveat that there's always something that we have to do that's better. And I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I think that we could go right to Eva, and I would suggest that we just take all the presentations together and then have the question and answers. And Eva will explain a little bit more about what the role of the UN is in protecting children on conflict after explain some of the UN's work.
Thank you very much, Sven. As Sven said, my name is Eva Smets. I'm the director for the Watchlist on Children and Armed Conflict. Of course, I'd like to thank the Liechtenstein Institute and also the mission of Liechtenstein to the UN for their help and support in organizing this event, but also for their support to the agenda at large. First of all, a few words in terms of what is Watchlist on Children and Armed Conflict. Because of course, you will recognize Human Rights Watch as an organization, but you might not know Watchlist. And that is how it should be, because Watchlist is a network of human rights and humanitarian organizations that work together to collect and disseminate information on children in situations of armed conflict, and then to target it towards those decision makers, specifically at UN headquarters and at the Security Council, in order for them to make the decisions for the effective programs and policies that we want them to make to better protect children. Some of the members of our web network currently are Human Rights Watch, and I'm very pleased to have the chair of our board here with us today, but also others that are very present on the ground in all of these country situations: Save the Children International Alliance, CARE International, World Vision, Norwegian Refugee Council, to name but a few for you today. So I've been asked to comment here today about what is the role of NGOs in this system. And after this wonderful explanation of Alec, now that you all understand very clearly how the system works in all of its intricacies, I will comment a little bit in terms of where do we NGOs, civil society, fit in and what can be our role. And my main argument with you here today is going to be that our role, obviously, is vital and crucial, but it is really there to hold the accountability mechanism, because that's how you can see the Children in Armed Conflict agenda, to hold that in its term accountable, so that it delivers and it really does bring about change and progress for children on the ground where it matters most. I will go over and I will give you some examples in terms of how can we do that, both at global levels, but also most importantly at the field level, in the countries, in those listed situations where conflict currently is taking place. So first I'll start with the role of NGOs in the Children and Armed Conflict agenda at headquarters, so at global level. And you are, of course, all going to forgive me that I'm going to use my own organization as the example of how you can do it. We as Watchlist, and again, I want to underline, rather than seeing it as an organization, it is a network bringing together all of those larger civil society organizations that are present in the affected countries and really speak as a unified voice and interact with the UN in a unified voice. We interact with the UN at the global level in, I would say, 3 ways. The first being an important role in just first-hand monitoring and reporting on which violations are taking place and bringing that information to the UN and pushing for action if we don't feel in our analysis that sufficient work is being done. A second role that is very important, and Alec already alluded to that a little bit earlier, is just interacting with the agenda at large and pushing forward the legal framework and the architecture that is put in place in order to implement this legal framework around the world. And a third role, I think this is very important, is to remain that independent voice, to be that watchdog, and to really see that after all is said and done, what is the success, what is the implementation, and is real progress being made? And if there is a lack of progress, raise our voices and point the attention, shed the light on what we feel may be missing in terms of impact. So let me go over those 3 ways of interacting with the agenda and give you some very specific examples. And by giving those examples, hopefully, again, teach you more about how does the agenda really work in practice, perhaps a step beyond going over the different parts and components of it. So first, first-hand monitoring, reporting of the violations that are taking place in specific country situations around the world. As said, the agenda since Resolution 1612, since 2005, has put in place a global monitoring and reporting mechanism. Therefore, information from the 14 currently listed country situation is theoretically coming to the Council and its working group on an annual basis from all 14 countries around the world. Therefore, we try to focus, when we do that first-hand primary research, on countries and situations that perhaps may not be quite as high up on the agenda of the international community as we would all like to. Yes, we know about Syria. Yes, we know about Mali. Do we also know about the Central African Republic? Probably not as much as we really should be. But also we try to collect information on those situations that require really urgent attention from the system. And that is, for example, a Mali. Action is needed, it is needed now, but do we really understand exactly what is happening? Do we have that information from the ground? The lines are shifting, the alliances are shifting. What is the impact for children? So those are the types of situations that we try to gather information about. Gathering this information and then disseminating it to policymakers can really help place certain situations higher on the list of priority and therefore, hopefully, trigger more efficient and effective response. I'm going to bring a very specific example on the Central African Republic. In 2011, Watchlist researched the situation, sent a researcher to the country, and published a comprehensive report on the situation of children in armed conflict in the Central African Republic. At that time, there were no action plans concluded with the armed forces, with armed groups, in the Central African Republic, although one of them, the APRD, had actually voluntarily released 525 children over a period of a year and a half. So for us, that was a situation that was not acceptable, because of course what happens, building on what Alec explained earlier, if the system does not conclude an action plan, this contract that was referred to, therefore a listed party or group cannot be delisted from the agenda, and this is a situation that creates persistent perpetrators over time, because they keep on every annual report being listed and listed. After our launch of the report, we launched it in New York, we also launched it in the country concerned. We did a lot of advocacy around the findings of the report, and a couple of months later, the SRSG, at the time SRSG Coomaraswamy, scheduled a visit to the Central African Republic, and 2 action plans were signed with these groups. They're not completely implemented at this point in time yet, but we have these contracts and we're moving forward. Of course, am I claiming that this is only because we published a report about it? No, in NGO advocacy and in advocacy overall, there's always this challenge between contribution and attribution. Can we attribute this entirely to our work? No, but have we contributed? Most certainly, and these are ways that can definitely contribute in an effective way. So secondly, driving forward the legal framework and the architecture. Again, giving you a concrete example and looking into the expansion of the triggers. Alec, in his presentation, referred earlier to a resolution that was voted in 2011, Resolution 1998, which expanded the trigger mechanism for the monitoring and reporting mechanism to include the grave violation of attacks in schools and hospitals. How can you influence something like that as a civil society organization? In 2010, I believe it was, a coalition was set up, a global coalition to protect education from attack. It was a hybrid coalition, actually. It was a coalition that united both UN agencies and civil society organizations, amongst which 2 of our network members, Human Rights Watch and Save the Children International Alliance. Then in December of that year, SRSG Coomaraswamy met with the NGOs for a brainstorming session, something that she always does when it's time to start thinking about what will we be putting forward in the upcoming annual report. During this meeting, the NGOs that were present there were quite vocal in pushing for better protection for schools and hospitals, well, for schools specifically, from attack, quoting recent research, the fact that this was an increasing trend around the world and an action was truly needed. And what later happened then, in May when the report was published, the first recommendation that the Secretary General put in the report, and I'll quote here, is to expand the gateway to annexes of my report to include parties that attack schools and or hospitals. Again, in the UN, nothing works without a report. So once this report was published, it was really what the chair at the time then for the working group needed in order to push for a new resolution that ultimately would be Resolution 1998, adopted in 2011, that expanded the trigger mechanism for the monitoring reporting network. So it's just one example, but I think it's an important example to show that when NGOs and civil society work in coalitions together with peers, that they can truly make a difference in pushing for new norms and standards moving forward. And then a third part in being and remaining that independent voice and that watchdog in terms of implementation and progress that is made on the agenda. And here, as my example, I will quote our recent and regular research in terms of the output for the working group. And those members of the working group who are present here today know what's going to come up. It's those dreaded watchlist statistics. So every year, on a yearly basis, we put together these nice statistics in terms of how have you been doing? So what is the quantity, what is the quality of the output of the working group on a yearly basis? Which country situations are being treated? How are they being treated? So this year, we published the results for the whole working group. They've been set up in 2006, including year 2012, so going over the 6 years of activity. And looking at the use of their toolkit, they have a toolkit that gives them the ability to apply certain measures with regard to certain perpetrators, but also look at, you know, the time that they've spent in negotiating specific country situations. How many countries have they been processing during the time that they get together? In general, because I know this gets a bit technical, the trends are not super optimistic. In terms of the tools that they've been using, we found that over time, on average, they've used about 8 out of 26 available tools, and usually the same 8 tools. And we also found that despite when they agreed on this toolkit in 2006, they originally put in a language that it was to be non-exhaustive and it was to be a living document. But despite this formulation, they've never gone beyond the tools that are actually in the toolkit, or have they reviewed the effectiveness of the usage since its adoption? And secondly, in terms of the time, how many situations are they processing? We found a very worrying trend. In 2006, they were able to process a country situation on average in about 3.4 months. Last year, they took on average 12.9 months, which is over a year, to deal with one country situation. The reason why we're worried about this, of course, is that if you have a situation like Mali, let's say, if you start discussing Mali in January 2013, like we have today, obviously, if you only reach a conclusion on it in January 2014, the situation is going to be hugely different. And whatever you've decided on, is it still going to be relevant? So these are just some examples of how NGOs can really work with the agenda and try to push it forward in order to be more effective at the global level. But now let me say a little bit more about the field level, and that is really about those local communities, civil society, and NGOs that work with the children in their own villages, in their own communities, in the countries concerned. And of course, that role is even more important than the role at the global level, because these are the communities directly working with their own children. Now, before I'm going to proceed my remarks, I really want to clarify. I'm not going to say about how NGOs or civil society are really important in terms of the programs that they deliver to these children. When children are identified in an armed group, when they are released from an armed group, and they need to be reintegrated into their communities, as Alex said, a very long-term job. That's very valuable work. It is best entrusted to civil society, but that's not what I'm going to speak about today. What I will speak about is the role of civil society and local NGOs and local communities in monitoring and reporting on these crimes. So I'm talking about local human rights activists, local child rights activists, much more than orphanages or aid workers, humanitarian aid delivery, etc. So the first thing I really want to say, and here I'm talking about the monitoring and reporting mechanism, that is this global mechanism that was set up in 2005 by Resolution 1612 to look at the situation and to bring that information back to the Security Council in New York. In all of the 14 country-specific situations that are currently listed, we would say that the trend is that the bulk of the primary monitoring is really done by civil society, by those community-based activists, by local hospitals, by church organizations, by local NGOs. This, of course, is not a big surprise, because civil society actors and local communities play this very vital role in the protection of their own children. They are eyewitnesses to child rights violations. They have an in-depth knowledge of the conflict. They have the trust of local communities because they're part of the local community. They can create that link of trust with the victim so that they feel that they're safe in order to speak up. They're present on the ground, also in areas that are usually inaccessible to members of the international community, to the UN, and they will remain on the ground long after the conflict has ended, quite contrary to any UN mission that is deployed in the field. So despite these obvious advantages of involving them in child protection on the ground, we found that the engagement of NGOs in the MRM is very uneven on the ground. Why is that? Now, first and foremost, there are situations that NGOs and civil societies themselves will say, no, I do not want to be part of this monitoring and reporting mechanism. And why is that? Because it's unsafe for them to do so. Certainly in those situations where the UN is in some way perceived to be a political actor. They are negotiating a peace agreement, they are involved in peace negotiations between the government and whoever is opposing the government, and therefore associating yourself too obviously with the UN may put you in a certain security risk or constraint. So in some situations, the NGOs themselves prefer to not be involved. But in other situations, we found that they can be very actively involved, especially in the role of primary data collection. But then what comes afterwards is that it's quite challenging for them to be involved in what comes after that primary data gathering. In screening of case databases, in trend analysis, in getting feedback of what is happening with those cases once you've submitted it. And so what really are some of the constraints going further between having NGOs out there doing primary data gathering and then having NGOs or local civil society engage in this monitoring and reporting mechanism in the follow-up steps, a more meaningful participation in the system? A few constraints. The first of those constraints is, and Alec already alluded to this earlier, the requirement for the UN-led verification of the data. The monitoring and reporting mechanism is a UN system, and as the manual for the monitoring and reporting mechanism states, the UN, or the Secretary General, ultimately is responsible for the quality of the data, and therefore needs to be the one who signs off on its quality. Therefore, verifying this data is in the hands of the UN, although most of the primary data is gathered or brought to whoever is the appropriate focal point for the mechanism in the country by civil society organizations. Now, in some countries, this verification or UN-led verification is quite pragmatically interpreted because a child protection section may have 1 to 3 staff members and countries may be very big. So how are they going to verify all of this information, triangulate, interview third, second witnesses, and so on and so forth? So in some cases it's quite pragmatically interpreted, but in others it's very rigidly sticking to it must be UN verified, which of course creates sort of like a bottleneck in terms of having data entering the system. The second constraint to what we call NGO empowerment is a lack of transparency in the action plan agreements. Action plan agreements, this contract that Alec earlier referred to, are between the listed party and the UN in country. They are, in general, not public documents. Unless the signatory party, the armed force or the armed group itself, may decide that they have no problem that this is publicly available in the country itself, which it is in certain countries. In other countries, it is not available, such as, for example, Myanmar. What does that mean for NGOs on the ground? Imagine you're a child rights advocate in eastern Myanmar or Burma, and you're coming across a group of soldiers. And they may not be as inclined to immediately implement or adhere to the commitments that their rank and file commanders have signed on to the action plan. If the action plan would be a public document, this is a powerful tool in the hands of a civil society advocate. They can engage with the perpetrating party at that point in time and advocate and explain this is not what you're supposed to do, and so on and so forth. If you do not have that document, if it is not public, of course it takes away that element of empowerment for your local advocate. One final point. So I'll conclude it here because Joe has some more points. But in my conclusion, I wanted to note that, as Alec also said, the MRM really exists in function of a very singular purpose. And a singular purpose of the MRM and of the agenda is to cease the violation from happening. Once your action plan is signed, it is implemented, it's verified that it's being implemented, the perpetrating party no longer perpetrates the violation, then the MRM will withdraw from this country and the party can be delisted and it's off the agenda. But the cessation of violation does not necessarily answer all of the questions for the affected community. And in this final point, I wanted to make this final point today here on the legal accountability for child rights violations. In July 2012, one of our partners from Nepal traveled to New York to talk to the Security Council in what we call an ARIA formula briefing. And he testified, in Nepal, the action plan did bring about an end of violation of the violation of recruitment and use of child soldiers, but it did not translate into legal accountability for the crime of child recruitment and use. Until this day, not a single perpetrator of child recruitment and use has been prosecuted in Nepal. So to us, this feels as if there is no real accountability for the perpetrators. And with that provoking statement, I will leave it open and invite Joe to give some more comments.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I think we can go into more details in the discussion afterwards. And with that, I would like to invite Joe Becker, who is the Advocacy Director of the Child Rights Division of Human Rights Watch, who will address a little bit more the issue. What can we do to hold persistent perpetrators accountable? What NGOs can do to hold them.
Thank you, Sven. I also want to thank the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination and Sven and the Liechtenstein Mission, and also Eva and the Watchlist for organizing this event. It's really great to see UN diplomats and UN staff so far from the halls of the UN and the missions in New York. It's nice to have this venue here at Princeton to really discuss the Children in Armed Conflict agenda, and especially thinking about the day tomorrow, how we can all increase pressure on the persistent perpetrators to end their violations against children. As Alec pointed out, it's now been 10 years since the Secretary General first started publishing this list of shame. And yesterday I went back and looked, and over these 10 years, there have actually been 140 distinct parties that have appeared on the list at one point or another. Now, some of these groups no longer exist. Some of them have merged with other forces. Some of them have actually ended their violations and been delisted, as Alec pointed out. Others have signed action plans that have not yet been fully implemented, so they're still on the list for now. But I do want to talk about, those parties that remain on that list year after year after year, and maybe some ideas for how we can better hold them accountable. Eva's already given a really good overview of NGO efforts and how we engage with the Children in Armed Conflict agenda. In addition, I'll mention briefly just 5 of the strategies that Human Rights Watch uses on these issues. One is documentation. We've been publishing reports on violations against children since 1994. We have gone to the field and literally interviewed hundreds and hundreds of children to get their testimonies and published reports on more than 20 countries. Last year alone, we documented violations by 34 different parties in 17 countries. But documentation alone is not enough. The second important point is use of the media. We try to ensure maximum media attention as part of the strategy of shaming, to expose these violations through newspapers, through television, radio, and online. A third strategy is direct dialogue with the parties. Last year, 2 of my colleagues were in Yemen, where they documented the use of schools for military purposes by different parties to the armed conflict. And they met with some of the commanders to talk about the devastating impact that this had on children's education. and the commanders actually ordered their troops to vacate quite a number of the schools. Or a few years ago, my colleague Corinne Defka met with, she had been documenting child recruitment by the Liberians United for Reconciliation and Democracy, the LURD, in Liberia. And she went to the leadership and she said, you say that you're fighting the government because of their human rights abuses, but by using children, you're proving that you're no better. Charles Taylor had just been indicted, and she said, do you want to end up like Charles Taylor, on trial in The Hague? And the leadership, shortly afterwards, put out new policies prohibiting the recruitment and use of child soldiers. And in cases where we can't access these groups, we have on occasion published public letters to try and bring attention to violations and encourage the parties to change their practices. A fourth point is engagement with the courts. We have given information to the International Criminal Court, to the Special Court for Sierra Leone. My colleague Corinne, who spent years in Sierra Leone, testified in the trial against Charles Taylor. And then fifth, we have also looked for opportunities to engage individual governments to put additional pressure on perpetrators. And the best example here is work that we and other NGOs did to get the US Congress to pass a law in 2008 that essentially prohibits US military assistance from governments that use child soldiers. The law came into effect 3 years ago, and over the last 2 years, the US has used it to withhold military financing and training from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And President Obama announced last October that he would not train a 2nd battalion in Congo until the DRC signed an action plan with the UN. And the DRC had been dragging its feet for 7 years, but actually signed the plan just a few days later. Now, clearly the UN had been pushing, the SRSG had been pushing, there are a lot of different actors at play here, but I think the prospect of having military assistance suspended was also a very influential point of leverage. So currently there are 52 parties on the Secretary General's list. And when the last one was issued in April, the SG noted that the number of persistent perpetrators had doubled from 16 to 32. Now that's if you consider groups that have been on for at least 5 years. And 32 persistent perpetrators, it's a large number. It's a little bit intimidating, a little bit overwhelming to think about. But maybe if we focus a little bit more narrowly and look at a smaller group, those parties that have been on the list from the very beginning, since 2002. There are 11 parties from more or less 5 or 6 countries. There are 3 government forces, the DRC, Myanmar, the SPLA in southern Sudan. And then there are non-state actors, the FARC, the ELN in Colombia, the Lord's Resistance Army, the FDLR, Mai Mai in DRC, and the MILF, NPA, and Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. So focusing some clear strategies on this smaller group may actually be a more achievable prospect. And in fact, 4 of these 11 have already signed action plans. So I want to now just lay out a few ideas for the Security Council, and especially thinking about the discussion tomorrow, about how we can focus more attention on the worst perpetrators. I have 7 brief points. 1 is follow-up reporting. We've heard that there are regular reports on the country situations that come to the working group and conclusions that come out. But very rarely has the working group ever asked for a follow-up report. It did this once in 2007, when it was considering Sri Lanka and child recruitment by the Tamil Tigers. It was so alarmed by what was happening in Sri Lanka that it said, we want another report in 6 months' time, and if the situation has not improved, we will consider additional measures. And that time pressure worked, because during that 6-month period, child recruitment by the Tamil Tigers dropped by 50%. But that's the only time that the working group has ever asked for a follow-up report. Second is deadlines. This example of the LTTE is one example of a 6-month deadline There are two others. Also with the LTTE, the working group gave them a 90-day deadline to sign an action plan. And in another case, it asked the Lord's Resistance Army for a response within 1 month. But these are the only examples that I can think of where the working group has put, a clear deadline to groups. It can create a stronger sense of urgency and also establish clear consequences if the deadline is not met. The third thing is special sessions. We have annual debates on children in armed conflict, but what about a special session just focused on the persistent perpetrators? Asking the Secretary General for a report just on the worst of the worst, and focusing recommendations on those groups, and a special debate just to devise actions to gain compliance. Fourth is looking for ways to better engage the resident representatives at the country level. The UN country teams are so critical in terms of engaging in dialogue. They're the ones that need to reach out to the parties that are committing the violations and negotiate the action plans. The working group could request direct briefings from the resident representatives to engage them more directly in the work of the working group. That kind of direct reporting could prompt the representatives to make the children in armed conflict agenda a higher priority for their work in country. The original perpetrators, the hardcore, 11 parties that I mentioned, are really only in 5 or 6 countries. Another idea is to bring the resident representatives from those countries together for a special consultation to exchange ideas about how to gain compliance. Fifth is to focus more on individuals. The SG's list is naming parties, but if we look at the sanctions capacities of our sanctions committees, they are often focused on things like travel bans, asset freezes that are applied to individuals, not to parties. The working group could request the Secretary General to include, wherever possible, the individual names of the commanders that are responsible for violations against children, and to forward those names to the relevant sanctions committees. And then sixth, Alex still thinks it's crazy, but I hope that the Security Council will continue to consider the idea of a thematic sanctions committee. It's not that wild.
No, I don't.
The fact is, we have a handful of sanctions committees related to specific countries, but many of the perpetrators that are on the SG's list do not have a corresponding sanctions committees. Clearly there are concerns about the idea, but I hope that the discussion can continue, and maybe one day we will reach the point where the Security Council is ready for that step. And then finally, the justice mechanisms and referrals to the International Criminal Court. I think especially last year with the convictions of Thomas Lubanga and Charles Taylor, there's more awareness than ever among military commanders that violations against children can bring criminal prosecution. Letters to justice mechanisms is one of the tools in the toolbox for the working group. And referring cases that involve persistent perpetrators to the ICC for investigation is certainly a powerful tool that can be utilized. So the challenge is that many of the persistent perpetrators don't care that much about the international community. There are some lovers that just aren't going to have a lot of influence with these groups. But the good news is that we do have, from the last decade, examples of what works, and we also have a lot of strategies that we can explore, either on their own or in combination. And so I think tomorrow is going to be a very rich discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing ideas from this group about how we can finally gain accountability from some of these groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Joe, and since we don't have so much time left, I would right away like to open the floor for any questions and comments you might have. Please.
Good evening. Thank you for organizing this. My name is Mauricio. I'm currently a student here at Princeton, but a few years ago I was political coordinator for Costa Rica in the Security Council during our term. Very proud of the work we did in this issue, and I guess I wanted an update to see how things are going. When we left the council, we were struggling to get SRSG Kumaraswamy to brief the DRC Sanctions Committee. I think that ended up happening eventually, and I was wondering whether it has now become practice for the SRSG for Children in Armed Conflict to brief the Council Sanctions Committees. The other question I had is one of the challenges we had, and we saw that it was across all missions, not just the Costa Rican mission, and we were quite a small mission, is that the thematic experts on children in armed conflict oftentimes focus so much on thematic issues that there wasn't that much interaction with the country-specific experts. So oftentimes, for example, when we were negotiating the mandate for the mission in the Central African Republic, there was quite a disconnect when I was calling my colleagues who were Central African experts. They didn't know what their expert on the Children in Armed Conflict Working Group was doing. So I was wondering about that as well. And thanks again for putting this together.
Thank you very much. I think that's precisely why we're doing this workshop, in order to solve exactly that problem. But I would propose we take 2 questions more, and then you can answer. Please.
Hi, my name is Tom Reisen. I'm from the mission of Luxembourg, currently chairing the working group, the Security Council. Well, I have a few questions, if you allow. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Thank you to the NGOs for presenting their work. I mean, there's one thing you didn't mention what you do, and that's your app, which is really great, which you did with Liechtenstein, and I would like to commend you on this because it's really a very useful tool. Eva, you've been speaking about the tools and the toolkit, everything we have at our disposal. I mean, these are things you can measure, right? To how many tools do we use, what tools we use most, and so on, the time spent on conclusions. But I would be interested to hear a little bit more on the qualitative aspect. What works best, which tool are most effective, because in the end that's what we really also need to know. And I'm not saying that the other statistics are not relevant, but it's important to see what we can achieve with the tools we have or we use. And then I would have a couple of questions for Alec as well. You mentioned how the whole Children in Armed Conflict agenda came to life. You said it was a kind of fortunate constellation of chance to have the right people, personalities at the right time. I would like to know how what is your assessment on the evolution of the agenda? We had great progress on the legal framework, you mentioned that, but the last resolution unfortunately was voted, so I would like to hear how you see it. Are we going backwards, or is the momentum gone? That's something I would like to hear from you. And then on the persistent perpetrators, I mean, we know that approximately 75% of those persistent perpetrators are non-state actors. So my question is the UN system better equipped to deal with state actors, and how can we tackle the non-state actors?
Thank you very much. And I think we should maybe answer those questions now, since they're already a very complex set of questions. Who would like to go first? Alec? Okay. Start with the last.
For our colleague from Costa Rica, a big thank you to Costa Rica for its time on the council. We had great progress, and Costa Rica has always been a friend, so thank you for that. I think, and my colleague Rosalie may correct me, because on the details I'm a little bit fuzzy all the time. She did, in fact, I think twice since that time, brief the council, brief the Security Council Sanctions Committee on DRC, and then subsequently has given names, but also has briefed Sudan and Somalia, I believe. So it has now picked up. We've actually briefed everyone except for Al-Qaeda Taliban, which have not adopted inside of their, because of course, as you know, they have to adopt it inside of their mandate. So that's our next battle. I know that the Germans wanted to handle that. Perhaps we'll ask Luxembourg to do so. I don't know. I know that Australia, I believe, are you Al-Qaeda Taliban? Yeah. So we'll come to you. That's strange formulation. It's another thing, because, but then, of course, it doesn't do away with the whole limitations of that's it. I mean, that's all of the mechanisms that we have at our disposal on sanctions. That's the thematic and the country-specific one. So we still remain with that big challenge. Oh, do you want me to go to the second question?
Would you like to?
Take it?
You want to do it?
So, for my dear friend Tom, with these very hard questions, I think times have changed. I think there is a conservatism in the council. I don't think it's as bad as last year. We don't have, it's the luck of the draw of who we get on. We got some great new members on this year. But we have some troublesome ones who have particular sovereigntist ideas about what the council should be doing and whether or not they can press as hard as we want. I think we haven't lost our momentum in that we're already there. I don't think even with the vote we've gone backwards. In fact, we got a report out of them, and a report that I think they haven't even realized to this point, at least the some of the ones that were normally back. But I mean, to tell you the truth, even a very conservative member of the council 2 years ago came to me before she left for her capital and said, "We know that it works. We know that that it's something worthwhile doing." But she said, "Keep your head down for 2 years because it's a rotten lineup." So I mean, so we know, and we have to wait out. Even though we have some great new friends on, sometimes you just have to wait it out. I think what it is now is that there's a larger discussion in the Security Council because there are the other thematics which are trying to follow in some ways in our path that are getting cut off. And I think the vote there was much more dangerous for those who haven't made it, who don't already have, a working group, who don't already have a system that's underway. I think it was also their volley against that to say, okay, we've had enough for now. And sometimes it's better to just hunker down and kind of protect what you have, try to consolidate, and then move when the mood gets better. Persistent perpetrators, you're right. I mean, I think we only have one listed member state of the United Nations that actually hasn't engaged in an act plan. That was Syria. Well, let's get to that when that comes. But I don't think it's about whether or not it's member states or non-state actors. There are several challenges about non-state actors, but some non-state actors like the LTT are very open. The MILF is another one, very open. We have had already, for example, with another very difficult NSA in the Philippines, the National People's Army, a furtive kind of first discussion, which did not go very well for various reasons. But we will probably then come to the point. I think we're at a point where we kind of exhausted the easy ones, and now we're getting down to the harder ones. And the hardest one being Abu Sayyaf, who everyone who goes to meet them, including some armed members of certain Western governments, gets abducted. So that's not a great kind of way to start a dialogue to get yourself done, although you will probably get their attention more than we usually do. But I think it's about that. I think we also have to, we are thinking about having more discussions on how to do that better, and I think we also will be discussing with our with our NGO actors on the ground. We've had several discussions already about how we are better at kind of pushing from each direction. And I think also more and more UN agencies are coming on board, which is also a different pressure mechanism. But I also endorse all of your suggestions on that as well.
Just on the persistent perpetrators, clearly there are more points of leverage for governments, and I think governments often feel more pressure to comply. But there have been quite a number of examples of NSAs that have already been delisted or who really want to get off the list. And a couple of other examples that come to mind are the KNLA and the Karenni Army in Myanmar. They've actually been contacting the office for years and years, asking to engage in the process to have an action plan so that they can be delisted, and there are access problems there. But and I think in the past there have also been some communications problems. There have been instances where NSAs didn't know that they were on the list because somehow there were not effective mechanisms to even communicate to them that they were on the list or what the possible consequences could be. I think those are getting better, but I think we can still look at those as well. But I think a big challenge is just trying to figure out what is it that matters to that NSA. Is it, you know, a moral argument? Is it the stigma of being on the list? Is it the possibility of prosecution? Is it a certain kind of sanctions? So there may be a need for more of a case-by-case basis for the NSA's curriculum.
Yes, before coming to Tom's question about the measurements and the statistics and the tools, I also wanted to pick up the question of our colleague from Costa Rica about mainstreaming the issue within the missions so that your country-specific expert will take it up sufficiently and work it into the resolutions that are specifically on a certain country rather than on a certain team. I think it's a very important remark to make. It's something that we're trying to push for with the app, with a new publication that we've taken up since this month, where very much like similar groups for peace and security, we're putting forward a monthly update at the start of each presidency, giving recommendations on how to integrate children in armed conflict points for each country. So really for the council experts to take this on, and really very much complementing our advocacy towards the working group with also advocacy towards those pen holders that are overseeing specific country situations and trying to integrate the mainstream CAC aspects into those resolutions. That's what we can do, of course, and our actions remain limited. In the end, it needs to be taken up by the missions themselves and integrated into how they work. And I think we had a conversation a little while ago with our colleague from France, sitting here, who sort of said himself how more and more within the mission they're trying to structure the team in such a way that thematic experts really understand who to liaise with and take this forward. So we also very much look upon this workshop, and especially the session that we're holding in the afternoon, to give more impetus on this, to really show more how you can integrate and mainstream children in armed conflict in country-specific resolutions. So really putting it more also back on the council's agenda, pushing the council to take more leadership and engagement, and not only deferring it to the working group, but really working hand on hand on those two aspects. On Tom's question, yes, the amount of tools is something quantitative. You can measure it, you can put it in a nice graph, but does it really tell you something in terms of the quality of that tool, whether it was the best tool to be used in a specific situation? That is a very good question. That is the only question that really needs to be asked in terms of the toolkit for the working group. Again, as ultimately an outsider, because we are not in the meetings with the council or with the working group, there's only so much that we can see in terms of once you do those conclusions, the conclusions are public documents, what is the follow-up action? What happens after you define your certain activities in your conclusion? Which ones are taken? What are the responses that you receive from governments, from armed groups? What are the lack of responses? What are the results? And all of that is not in the public realm, so we don't know. And it's a very urgent question that we think is very, very useful to raise, and it's one of the reasons why in our last briefing we said, well, the working group has never really evaluated how its tools have been used and which one are effective and which one are less effective. So in a sense, it's asking that question back to you now, understanding it is a sensitive environment, so it may be a sensitive question to deal with and to go through internally in the working group, but it's not one we can answer for you. Or you should let us, give us your archive and go to it.
Thank you very much, and I think it's also a very academic question. I think it's a very good job for academic institutions to really go in and research what tools work and what haven't worked. And that's an interesting question that throughout the years pops up all the time, and we hear that wherever we are. And to go back to Costa Rica, what we kind of observe is that the bigger the missions are, the more problems you have with silo thinking, And that's exactly why we developed those tools like the app to give the expert the information while he's sitting in the negotiations and negotiating this resolution. So he has all this information coming from the thematic agenda available on his fingertips.
Sven,
Thank you very much. Okay, last round of, we have enough time, I think so.
It's not really a question, it's just a comment. Hi, my name is Marianne Bauer. I'm from the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. And on that point with the siloization, one thing that we did once with, I think it was the mission of Portugal, together also with the Watchlist and the Office of the Special Representative, is that we organized, Portugal invited us for a briefing with their country-specific experts, all sitting around a table where then the Office of the Special Representative, Watchlist, and us could really discuss with them the specific issues that children have in all these countries, and I found that was a very useful.
Exactly. And here what we also could do, we have to engage more the Security Council coordinators, who are those who basically distribute the work, and they are the ones who basically need to step in here. And I haven't seen any Security Council coordinator really working on that issue, and I think this would really be one thing that would improve the situation dramatically. Anraj?
Thanks the panel, thank you all the panelists, and I think we have a lot of interesting thoughts for tomorrow as we go on our session. One of the things that I wanted to pick up on was what Joe had mentioned about the focus on individuals, and interestingly this week there is a Sanctions Committee on Somalia, discussions on Somalia and also on Sudan, and I just wanted to bring to your attention, as we are thinking about what could be possible options, we just spoke to both experts on the both sides, Sanctions Committee on Somalia and Sudan, and it's a interesting dilemma at both the places. You have in Somalia, no one wants to collect information on the individuals because they see the risk of to both the humanitarian, especially the humanitarian actors. If you do collect information on individuals, not that you don't know, but there we have a challenge where you don't get the information on individuals, whereas in Sudan, you have individuals, you know who they are, but you don't have information on the violations. Interestingly, one of the panel experts said that the report will be coming out in 2 days, and I'm glad that it's being made public, but said that this time it's hard for us to even justify that the violations committed by some of these armed groups are violations of ISL, because most of them they are confronting with the government and they are not attacking the civilians. I don't think that it's that there is no violations happening, but you have a situation where you don't get information on these violations by the perpetrators, where you know who the perpetrators are, and then you have other dilemma where you can't collect information. So how do we address these kind of practical realities, even where you have sanctions committees? So I thought that it will be interesting for us good for us to think through some of these practical challenges.
Well, I'm actually grateful to this question. I would like to remind my friends from the UN that you are sitting here in one of our holy halls where, amongst others, the ICC, the Special Working Group on the Crime of Aggression, has been for I don't know how many, 5 times I think over the years. And we also have our weekly seminar on international relations for faculty and students. And one of the frequently asked questions is, how effective are international organizations? And Madam Becker, you raised an issue which I found very intriguing, and the last question I sort of went into this direction also, and that is, as somebody who in his professional career has seen abuses of children and the victimization of children in conflict, how can one create something which isn't only part and parcel of an endless and quite complicated inter-institutional discussion and debate with all the various pitfalls, and as you rightly said, sometimes you have to wait it out, and like really tactical game, while people are suffering and dying. And actually I'm convinced the more kids suffer from it, the more conflict will be perpetuated. Or then you have the problem that you might well, I mean, who goes out there and really sort of looks and then reports without being himself a target or herself a target? And so my question specifically is there any effect by certain cataclysmic reporting. So effects like we had Amperman in the Balkan conflict, we had in Chechnya, we have now in Syria. Does this sort of mobilize action, or is unfortunately the whole process very much hostage to in intercouncil and UN bureaucracy?
Thank you, Doctor, for that. I think that well, I'm not going to even touch the effectiveness of
no, don't in here. No.
I mean, I have my own gut. But I think on this particular issue, again, even in Syria, we have had access. We are now, the UN system is now gearing up, and Salim will be going out there to assist in this, to do better reporting on it so that we can show the face of children better in a more real-time way, which will not solve the issue completely, but at least it will hopefully push those actors, including the non-state actors and the government themselves, who will be shamed into it. I mean, when knowledge is power, everyone has a friend. So friends, even the nasty friends, don't like to have it. Syria has very few friends, but even those friends are reticent when there are massive violations going on. Now, again, it's a political process, we'll have to see. But I think one thing is that the FSA has already started to approach us, saying that because we're getting some information that we've got some things with regard to children, and they have already contacted us and said they are willing to speak. So on that side, we'll probably progress. With the government, I'm not so sure. But we still have to be able to put it on paper that, look, we have approached the government, they have these responsibilities. If we do have an accountability mechanism that comes on, for sure, child crimes will be out there, like Thompson, Ngos, and the others. Obviously, Syria is not seized by the ICC, not a member, but you never know what will happen down the road, or if there will be a regional type of court that comes along to address that. It doesn't really address the problem that there are children dying in Syria, but it has driven some of the humanitarian response. It is getting that kind of package of information that tells you you're not just talking about people, children, you're talking about women, you're talking about civilians, and it packages it for better absorption and perhaps better action, with all the caveats that it's not perfect. So,
these are both really good issues, and I also get real frustrated at the slow pace and the bureaucracy sometimes. With the Children Around Conflict agenda, as the mechanism has gotten more sophisticated, it has some real assets about it, but it also means that it's really slow. So now you have to have a year of documentation before a party appears in the text of the SG's report. And then it has to be another year before they make it onto the annex. And then it will be a year or two before the first report comes to the working group. And the working group doesn't want to impose sanctions when it comes up the first time, so it has to be the second report. So already you're 5 or 6 years from when violations have been first documented. And when you think about the impact on the lives of children, it is kind of excruciating. But in terms of the documentation and linking commanders and violations, and it is a challenge. And I think there we need to think more about the complementarity of different actors. And certainly humanitarian and UN personnel who are on the ground may be really at risk, but that's where you can set up investigation teams or utilize outside entities like Human Rights Watch or others who don't have those same risks. So we've been going in and out of Syria for a year and a half now, and have through various testimonies implicated over 100 individual commanders in various crimes. But because we don't have a presence on the ground, we don't have staff that are at risk in the way that you're describing. So we just need to think about all the different actors and how we can set things up to get the information that we need.
Eva? Okay.
Can I just add one thing, which is I forgot about it, but I think it's important when we speak about sanctions. With all the individuals, whether or not we can get the right information, you are also then, some of these non-state actors that we deal with also have lawyers, who some call really blacked out. But one of the things that often gets thrown at us is the Caddy case, the European Court's Caddy case, which basically says that has ruled on sanctions being applied, and I can't remember, against Caddy, who I think was accused of being Al-Qaeda, I can't remember, from the terrorism violation. And then we also then have that same thing. We have an out, because if we approach them on an action plan and they reject it, that is basically our reach out to them. That makes the due diligence of us informing them, us reaching out to them. But that takes time. But if we go beyond that, if we start trying to get sanctions, without going through all the motions of trying to get an action plan and trying to approach them, we could drop into the kind of Connie type of argument, which is that I'm not aware, I'm being sanctioned because you didn't approach me. It's not as difficult as it sounds. It just means we have to do our due diligence, and we have to report, and we have to seek to contact. But there is that element there that we do have to keep in mind when we're talking about sanctions, because it is an issue. It has come up very much more in the terrorism, counterterrorism.
Thank you very much, and I think with this, the time is already over. I think we have some very nice thoughts and ideas for tomorrow to discuss, and that was the idea of the panel, what would you try to achieve today. And I would like to thank you for participating, and maybe I give it to Beth some housekeeping issues. What are we going to do with the dinner?
Yes, for those of you who are joining the dinner tonight, we will be at the Nassau Club, which is located at the corner of Mercer Street and Nassau Street. Nassau Street is the main street that you, I'm presuming, mostly walked on to come here to campus. So just walk up Nassau Street about 5 blocks, and it'll be right on the corner. You can't miss it. It's a giant yellow, sort of cream and white building. Tomorrow we'll be beginning at 8:30. We won't be in this building. It's light breakfast at 8:30, so feel free to sleep in and skip breakfast if you want. Meeting will start at 9. We won't be, as I said, in this building in Robertson Hall. We'll actually be just down a bit in Wallace Hall. And when you come to campus, you'll see the fountain behind the building here. It's the building directly behind that down the steps. So Wallace Hall 300, it's on the 3rd floor. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to email Swen or Eva or myself or Angela Matheny, who's been handling all the administrative details for this. Thanks.
Hey, how are you? I'm sorry, I just saw your email like an hour ago. Yeah, I do remember.
Looking at our old emails and get that.